All right, listen, I am, first of all, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're healthy, safe.
You.
Congratulations. I have an arc. I don't got the real one yet, but I'm gonna order it. I'll go down the street and buy it. But congratulations on the release of this book. And I have so much to say to you and so many things to ask and many things I want to talk about. But before I do, there are some things I need to say just about how I feel about the work that you're doing. I think we don't live in a space. Look, if we've learned anything from COVID, is that you better give folks their flowers. You know what I mean? Like, you say the things you need to say to people. And honestly, Morgan, I just feel like you're a courageous writer. I think that you approach literature with a hammer, which to me is the best way. I think that you stand on your square. You say the things that you mean. You let the chips fall where they may. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think that those of us who sort of change the landscape are those of us who are unafraid to sometimes stand alone and say the hard thing. And so good on you. The other thing that I wanted to mention before we really is delved a word?
Delved.
Delved?
Let's roll with it.
You one delves, but is it anyway, before we delve in, is really quickly, please buy this book from Books Are Magic. The link is right there for you. Make it happen. It's interesting. As much as we have to support our authors, we have to support our bookstores. This is a very, 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 very important time. And everybody is struggling. No matter how many of these we do, the truth of the matter is that none of us are okay. So please hit the link, folks who are listening. Please buy this book, buy multiple copies of this book. Please support the bookstore, support Morgan. It's very, very, very important. To start, Morgan, I want to talk about the title. Now, here's the thing. You're gonna have a few of these. You're gonna be on tour. Everybody's gonna ask the same questions. We know how the tours go. But because I'm a poet and because this is my original discipline, I saw the title, right? And I was like, I'm like, come on, it sounds a lot like Arna Bontemps. Like So I'm like, yo, Arna Bontemps. I know he was a Louisianian. Is a Louisianian?
Louisianan.
A Louisianan. I know he was a Louisianan. And I know him because he was also the best friend of Langston Hughes, but he was a Louisianan. And so for the people who are listening, I want to make sure you get a little bit of context about the title of this book. Arna Bontemps is the poet. She pulled this up from a line from one of his poems called Nocturne at Bethesda. And there's this one stanza, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to read a different stanza, and it'll frame this conversation. So there's this one stanza where he says, "The golden days are gone. Why do we wait so long upon the marble steps? Blood falling from our open wounds, and why do our black faces search the empty sky? Is there something we have forgotten, some precious thing we have lost, wandering in strange lands?" Right? Now, further down, as he continues with his sort of, he's basically mining his own conscience, and he's thinking about all these things that are happening. And there's a part where he imagines his own death, right? Where he says, like, basically, if I die, this, that, and the third. And after he sort of explains, or at least sort of poses his own death, he said, or posits his own death, he says, "Yet I hope still I long to live, and if there can be returning after death, I shall come back, but it will not be here. If you want me, you must search for me beneath the palms of Africa. Or if I am not there, then you may call to me across the shining dunes. Perhaps I shall be following a desert caravan." Now, I know this poem. Morgan has taken a bit of this poem, but that second stanza that I read is all about the idea of, like, when it's my turn to actually have an opportunity to go home, right? The whole thing is about when I come back, don't look for me here, because I'm not going to be here. Yeah. I'm going to be somewhere else where I feel like I belong, because here I am wandering in a strange land. This whole book to me, and I read it twice, this whole book to me it feels like an exploration of not just the sort of polythic identities of Black people, but also an exploration of the idea of our homes, plural, right? And so I wanna begin there. Now, the first line of the book, and so this is what I want to ask first. The first line of the book grounds us in um, even you trying to understand the home, the family that you're born into, right? And so the first line of the book is, I was 7 years old when I learned that I wasn't my father's only daughter. So from the very beginning of the book, we're sort of catapulted into the complexity of our lives, the complexity of our home lives, the complexities of our families. And so I guess I just want to ask you first and foremost, why start there? Now, trust me, now believe me, it is clearly a propellant, right? I'm like, oh, I was in immediately, right?
In there, yeah.
Why start there?
Okay. After the success of This Will Be My Undoing, I was visiting my father, and my father, he's a jokester, but he had a very serious look on his face, and he was a little upset that I didn't talk about him as much as I spoke about my mother in the first book. And I didn't have the courage to say I wasn't ready to go there yet. Because to be honest with you, I never really felt confident in my standing in my father's family. For one thing, my mother and my father, they had a relationship while he was separated. And so he already had a family. And I also lived with my mother full time and visited my dad. And I mentioned in the prologue, when I would go visit them, it just felt like they were Leave It to Beaver. Like they had, the fence, the affluent neighborhood, the dog, the private schools. And I just felt so out of place. So there was a part of me growing up that almost made it seem like I was never meant to be here. Like me existing was sort of an aberration or a thorn in this family side, even though they never treated me that way. It just made me feel that way. And it was often influenced by my Black Christian background. We're talking about illegitimate children and et cetera, et cetera. And so when I wrote this book, it was so healing for me because it made me realize that lineage and paternity and family lines are often so complicated. And so the reason why I started with that is like, I could have started with a quote about the transmission or lack thereof of African American memory. I could have started with the Great Migration, but as many of you may or may not know, I started off as a personal essayist and someone who's an opinion writer. So the way that I go in is to submerge within first and talk about myself and to just say like, the reason why I had to go back and to find these multiple homes was not only to connect myself into the larger fabric of Black American experiences, but to also heal some wounds that I had within my family tree.
It really felt like, narrative nonfiction, I think is probably, to me, one of the most important sort of genres, if you will, of writing. I think, we have so many, within our community, there's so many brilliant ones, from Kiese Layman, Saeed. There's right now we're experiencing this incredible moment, right? Imani, there's so many people who are just killing it. And so I think, but I think for it feels like for us, and by us I mean for the greater Black community, as sort of splintered and different as we are, reading a book that begins like that, it made me feel like, all right, this is going to be a story about Morgan and a story about me, right? Because I think there are so many things that are different, and there's so many things that are so similar. And so a prime example, Morgan, honestly, and I gotta just be, the book was wow to me because our families are very similar in a lot of ways. I was like, yo, like the fact that you start, this sort of first section is taking place down in the Low Country. For those of y'all who don't know what the Low Country is, Georgia, South Carolina, we're talking about the Sea Islands here, the Gullah Islands, right? Geechee folk, right? Charleston, right? We're talking about that whole sort of section of the country. And that's where my people are from. My folks are from.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So my folks are often, that's why I was like, oh shit. Like,
where are they from?
My folks are from Springfield and Orangeburg. My folks are from, yeah. All my folks are from South Carolina. And we always used to say, like, I wonder, my grandfather, my mother always asked and wondered whether or not he was a Gullah man, but he didn't know because of the way that his family was all broken and stretched out and but he experienced similar things in terms of the acquisition of land I mean, this man had 200 acres of land, and we don't know how he got it. Or his great grandfather got it. You know,
Yeah.
he got it. And so, can you talk a bit? Can you just? And I want to frame it because you got to forgive me, Morgan. I'm trying not to give too much away because this is the launch day, and I want to make sure everybody buys the book. The link is in the chat, by the way. So I don't want to give too much away. But can you just, as we sort of continue with the framework of home, can you just talk about the beginning of this journey for you, which started out going down south?
So I will say this, the way that I was trying to figure out, I was like, where am I going to go? I know I had to go to the South, but where am I going to go? Am I going to go to Mississippi Delta? Am I going to go to Virginia? Like where? And I realized the unifying force, at least for me as an African-American, is food. I can go to Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles in Los Angeles and give me some soul food. I can go to Sylvia's in Harlem and get soul food. I can go to Houston, Texas to get soul food. And that table, that plate, I've known it's very common, the collard greens, the yams, the fried chicken. And I said, okay, so within that subcomponent of food, what is something distinct about it? That's something special besides making the meal. And every New Year's Day, for as long as I can remember, my mother would make collard greens and black-eyed peas. Collard greens for the green for money, and black-eyed peas for good luck. And I said to my mother, I said, why do we do it? Just why? I'm a curious person. And she said, it's just something we do. And I was like, no. I didn't say that to her like that, but I was like, no. It's not just something that we just do. It's something that we were conditioned or taught to do, but there has to be a root there, pun intended. So I started researching and I said, okay, this it's superstitious a bit. Where does this come from? And I looked on one of the bags that I used for black-eyed peas, and there was a recipe called Hoppin' John. Mm-hmm. And when I was like, Hoppin' John, never heard of it. But I was like, okay, the dialect, I think, is a black thing. So I looked up Hoppin' John, and it originated from the Low Country, particularly South Carolina, particularly with the Gullah Geechee people. And it is said that, according to the International African American Museum, which was set to go, open this year, but it's going to open next year, hopefully, that 80% of enslaved Black people that came to the colonies set foot on a Charleston dock. And so that basically meant to me that we're all indebted to Gullah Geechee people. Gullah Geechee people are the oldest, if not the oldest, micro-ethnic group of African Americans in this country. They are also known for having the highest retention rates of West African cultural traditions, because on the rice plantations down there, they were very isolated and they outnumbered their slave masters. So when they got done work, they were able to go and farm and fish and be able to foster these communal practices. So when I thought about that, I was like, oh, I'm going there. I got to go there. And so the way that I started, which I'm so excited of talking about it, is I knew for a fact that I'm Black, but I don't know everybody. I knew that I live in New York. I may be seen as a part of the establishment to some Black people. I'm going to these rural communities. So before I even went somewhere, I made sure every route I went to, I connected with the people before I got there, to let them know who I was, see a picture of me, to show proof that I had a book contract, everything. And I got in touch with a woman named Tiffany Young, who was based in Darien, Georgia, McIntosh, Georgia. It was about an hour outside of Savannah. And when I was talking to her about it, she literally said to me, when you go down here, when you come down here, you're going to see stuff that you've never seen before. And she was right. Everything from the rice plantations to the folklore, the magic, to the spiritual energy was so palpable. And I realized by going down there that we're indebted to those people, and so much is at stake.
Did you, I love it. You heard like the Geechee folks speak? Did you hear like their language and like?
Oh yeah, I heard that. I heard that. I didn't even know Kumbaya, for all you know, and Kumbaya for Gullah people.
It's Gullah.
I had no idea that Kumbaya is come I hear like that's Gullah dialect. No idea. Crazy. But that's what we're talking about, right? It's this extraction of information without the source. And it wasn't until I went there that I found that out. And I was like, what, this whole time?
I think it's so fascinating, right? I think the sort of our kaleidoscopic lives, right? And I think it's one of these things where so many things that we all feel is a stereotype, right? Like fried chicken and black-eyed peas and collard. It's like, no, it's not a stereotype, right? It has cultural roots, right? It isn't just like, oh, Black folk love fried chicken. It's like, no. All these things come from a very specific place. They have a very specific lineage. They have, like there's a reason that we have held on to all these different people, these different things, these different customs. I remember when I was in college, I was studying with a brother named Ron Walters, who was one of the foremost academics around the conversation of reparations at the beginning of that discussion. He's passed away now.
Okay.
OG, and one of these old brothers. And he used to always tell us how Black folks who say, you grew up in a certain environment, you grew up saying she be, we be, I be, he be, and how if you go back far enough, right, there are tribes in Western Africa where be goes after the pronoun.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
I know.
And that's why it was like, we're both on the internet. So another thing that inspired me was that we have these conversations with Black people across the country. And even though we're distinct, there's something unifying as well. So I said I had to start with food because food is all I have. I may not know the basis of other things, but food, I feel like I had the most to hold on to and to be able to carry me as I went to these different regions.
Absolutely. Let's get into, after we get into food, we get into something that I also am so interested in. So you start talking about root work.
Oh my God.
Now, this is something, this is something I think is so, first of all, I just think it's important that we sort of shine light on root work and on how it is a part of our culture, whether you like it or not, whether you believe in it or not, look, my grandfather passed away, they were like, let's clean out all the closets. My grandfather was one of these men that allowed every old lady wanted to date him. He was one of these kind of guys, right? Yeah. And after he died, and this is what you always hear about root work, actually. And after he died, they had us clean out the closets, and in his closet was a jar, and in that jar was a root, and none of my family members would touch it. Oh. And so my mother was like, Jason, you got to go in there and get it. And I was like, why do I have to?
Why you got to get it?
It's like, because the spirit's always going to be kind to the child.
Excuse me? Oh,
it's like, go in there. Yeah, it won't affect you. It won't affect you. Now, this is the same woman. And then we're going to get back to you because I don't want to. But I'm so happy to talk to you. We'll have to just talk offline. But this is the same woman, my mother, who grew up in this tiny town in South Carolina, who, when she was a child, and anytime anybody died, and you mentioned this in your book with the open windows, right? Anytime somebody dies in the house, you open the windows, let the spirit out. Back when my mom was growing up, when you died, you went to the funeral, you had to pass the children over the casket. And so
I heard about that.
They would lift the baby.
Why was that?
So the reason why is because they would lift the babies and pass them over the casket so that the dead person would recognize the child and not come back and haunt them.
Oh, see. Oh my Lord. So all right. So I guess I'll riff off of that. So I really love what you said. I'm going to tweet it later when you say I approach literature with a hammer, because that means a lot to me. I grew up in a Black Christian community, Pentecostal, full of ecstasy. Very Christian, full of ecstasy and passion. But I'm so interested in the contradictions in Black American beliefs. What I mean by that is, for example, anytime we brought up roots, it was seen as demonic. Mm-hmm. But yet, when somebody dies, you got to open up the window. Oh, don't let anybody touch you. Don't let anybody make your food. You know what I'm saying?
Don't let them touch your hair.
Don't let nobody touch your hair. All these certain things, you know what I'm saying? And so I thought to myself, okay, my family doesn't believe in it, but you know about its power. Because if you didn't really believe in it, then why would you speak about it in such a precarious way? And so when you go down, like I said, when you go down to the Low Country, you realize that back in the day on those plantations, conjure and root work and Christianity were in synchronicity with each other. It was only when we started migrating, not only, because I'll say white supremacy has a lot to do with that, which is another conversation about African traditional religions and all that. White supremacy has a lot to do with it, but also migration. When we started migrating to the north and going into these urban cities and started to go to actual doctors instead of village healers, then we started to look at all that stuff as backwards.
Yep.
And so for me, when I went down there, I was like, I know what I was raised with, but these people are so connected to the land, to heaven and earth, rather, their ancestors. And in a way, I felt connected too, because when I spoke to Tiffany, she even said to me on the phone, she was like, I wouldn't have took your call. She's like, I've had people come to our communities, scholars and journalists alike, come down here, sometimes record us without their consent, do scholarship work, and wouldn't even acknowledge it. Said, but I felt something in you. And that's why I know you have to come down here. And I remember, you know, when I went there, I was just learning about root doctors, root workers, Dr. Buzzard, if any of you heard of one of the most famous, not the famous root doctor in the Low Country. And there were times when I was driving over bridges in South Carolina and going past the water, and I was like, I just feel connected. Like it could feel like my car could just start levitating. It just felt, because I was by myself as a woman, a very small woman. I'm only 5 feet tall, and I just felt connected. And I remember I went to one sea island. It's called Dalfusky. It's in South Carolina. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to in my life. And one of the guys that I met, he gave me a bag with like powder and all these sorts of things in it. And it was a way like to bring love into my life. And I'm just saying, I say in the book, I'm like, the guys wouldn't leave me alone after he gave me that. And I was worried because I was like, if I keep it in my bag, I'm like, a spirit's gonna haunt me and all that. But like, they didn't. It was fine. You know what I'm saying? And so it made me just question, like, why is it I think it's something that demonic when that's been a form of survival for Black people down south for so long? And maybe I need to rethink a couple of things.
Yeah, and some of that stuff, we only, you know, media is funny because it only tells us the parts of ourselves that scare us. You know, but it won't, right? But it won't actually expose the parts of ourselves that will cause us to love us. And that's a complicated thing, right? Something to think about. And I read that part of that first section just smiling because I'm like, so much of this is what I grew up around. My mom still to this day is like, I mean, hardcore into everything, all of it. And
Really?
and I grew up in a house where she would say, look, whatever you see in this house, you tell nobody outside of it. Because she knew that Black people wouldn't understand and would say that we were doing this or doing that. But really, she's like, this is just old traditional stuff that I was taught as a kid. It ain't nothing about the devil. It's just, no, this is just what we were taught. It's a spiritual practice that we were taught outside of the church. Now, from there, you get into another one of my favorite topics when it comes to Black folks. And I know we only have a little bit of time, and there's just so much to cover in such an expansive, broad scoped story. But I'm going to try to get to as much as possible without giving too much away. By the way, folks who are listening, put your questions in the Q&A box because we are going to get the questions in about 15 minutes. And I want to make sure we have lots of questions. There has to be questions because Morgan has had quite a journey here in this book. And if you don't have questions, I got all the questions. So, but please feel free. So after we talk about root work, then you talk about my favorite subject, Black people and water. Yo, so this is something I think that is so, so, so important. I'm not even sure. It used to be back in the day. I don't know if you know this, Morgan. Back in the day, it used to be that you couldn't graduate from Howard University unless you learn how to swim, unless you take a swim class.
Get out of here.
Yeah, it was
what?
like a thing. Yeah. It was like a thing. It was like a whole thing about you had to learn how to swim because of many of the things that you discuss in this. And then also, I really just appreciated how deep you went into trying to figure out what is the deal with Black people and water.
Yeah. Man, so I would just say, again, contradictions. My mother grew up in Atlantic City, which is on a barrier island. Almost suffered a fatal drowning accident. Never learned how to swim. Neither her siblings. I almost suffered a near fatal drowning accident, and it felt like I don't want to say a tradition, but something cyclical that was happening with swimming. And you know, my mother would say, "Oh, it's because of the chlorine. You know, chlorine is not really kind to hair, especially kinky, coily hair." But I was like, wait a minute, but the men keep their hair low and they're not getting it either. And I wanted to start off by saying, like, I've heard about water. It's been, you know, people make, like, you know, Black comedy, Black comedians talk about it with like not being able to swim and drowning. It takes on serious form. But if you think about it, it's our legacy for so many different reasons. It runs the gamut. And that's what I wanted to show people. The transatlantic slave trade. We don't know how many enslaved Africans were tossed over because of disease and malnutrition or drowned. You know, and I even quote in my book, you know, the Atlantic Ocean is like a floating graveyard, you know, for a lot of people, a lot of Black people. I think about in the rice plantations. You know, I remember, I'm gonna give you an anecdote, and I think I said this in the book. I went to a rice plantation in Low Country, Georgia, Butler Island plantation, and we were out there. I was out there with Tiffany Young, and she said, "Do you see that crocodile over there?" And I said, "What crocodile?" She said, "Right there." And I said, "Where?" She said, "Right there." It took me a couple of minutes, and I was like, "Oh, there it is." And I was like, "Damn, if I were had to work out here, I would have died." And she said, "A lot of them did die." And when she said that, I was like, the water is so treacherous for us, not only for the you know, for our ancestors that toiled there, that had to deal with crocodiles and such, but even to this day, there are a lot of you know, enslaved Black people that are in these dirty waters surrounding these plantations, and there's nothing to commemorate them. So their ancestors came from West Coast, sorry, excuse me, you know, West Africa, to come all the way over to the colonies, and they're still floating in a sense. I think about in terms of water with regards to leisure. You know, in the north, you know, there were segregated pools. You know, before Black people started migrating in droves, poor white people, rich white people did not, you know, they were not swimming in the same pools. But then when Black people started to come up, they're like, oh, we got to band together and be white, you know, because of the outside. No, for real, because of the outsiders.
You got to be
But
white.
But also, I remember I made a mistake, and I hope that people can pay attention to like the misguided assumptions that I had about Black identity. I thought all Black people had an aversion against the water, and it wasn't until I spoke to Tiffany, who was a Gullah Geechee woman. She was like, "No, that's not true." And according to Marquetta Goodwine, or otherwise known as Queen Quet, water is the bloodline. But when you go down to low country, you see the separation. Even in certain sea islands, like their water is tainted with lead and other poisons. And it reminded me of Flint, Michigan. It reminded me of Newark, New Jersey. So this is where we talk about like this stakes that we have here when it comes to water. It could be a form of leisure. It could be a form of transformation with regards to, you know, baptism and the River Jordan and freedom. And you think about how Gullah Geechee people, a lot of times their cemeteries are directed towards the water because they believe that when they die, they go back across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa. At the same time, it could be a form of disappearance. It could be a form of death. You know what I'm saying? The unknown. And so that's what I wanted to show with Black people is that it encompasses so much for us, and that's why it's so heavy. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, I thought you did such a wonderful. I mean, you really unpack the water topic just brilliantly because it's so complex. I mean, I mean, my mom is terrified of the water, but also believes in the spiritual elements and the cleansing nature of the water. And so she's like, I can't get in it. I want to get in it, but I'm so afraid, you know. But she raised her kids to be able to swim, right? And so for me, I spend most of my time in the water, right? Like I'm a dude, like I ain't going to the gym, I'm going to the pool.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
No.
With all this hair, and I'm in the water and I'm getting busy. When we weren't in quarantine, every other day I was in the pool every other day. You know, because that's where for me it feels like home. Like it feels like where I'm supposed to be, you know.
Right.
But I won't swim in the ocean.
Oh.
Right? So that's the thing. So I swim in the pool where it's controlled. But I'm terrified to swim in the ocean because I can't control it because it can be calm and then it can be deadly.
It's too deep. You don't know.
You don't know.
You don't know. You just don't know. And I think what's interesting in pop culture is like Beyonce's Lemonade, where she's with the women going into Lake Pontchartrain. You look at the Atlantics, where it's in Senegal, and you know, migratory patterns. You look at Daughters of the Dust, for example, and it's all of these different. What's that?
So shout out to Julie Dash.
Okay, water is it's heavy. It's life and death, and it's the unknown. And like I think, and I wanted to talk about just spiritually. We may not know about epigenetics and the passing down of trauma and how it affects our gene expression. We may not know about the depth of the transatlantic slave trade and what happened across that journey. But I think we all intuitively feel that heaviness from centuries before.
Yeah.
And whether or not we're cognizant of it, that does, influence how we move through land and water.
Absolutely. I heard a myth. I don't know if it's true, but it was told to me years ago that the reason there's so many sharks on the East Coast is because of the dead bodies of Africans. That's what led sharps to the East Coast of America.
Oh.
I don't know if it's true. It's an interesting myth. And then I heard another myth a million years ago. It's a well documented sort of piece of lore. Now you should check it out. You'd love it. It's about all the slaves that jumped off all the enslaved people that jumped off the boats. There's a myth that says, what if perhaps they never died and gave birth to people underwater? And it's tied into the myth of Atlantis. And it's this whole thing about a free.
Don't do that, because I'm like, that might be a next book idea. That might be a next creative project. I'm like, wait a minute.
Hey, look, that one's for free. Next one I'm gonna charge you for, Morgan. That one's for free.
I know. I was like, wait a minute, don't take that. Don't take
that. So look, from South Carolina and Georgia, this incredible sort of pilgrimage that you're on, which is really what this was, right? This incredible pilgrimage that you're on leads you to what I believe is the greatest place in America, Louisiana. And when you get there, and by the way, when I say the greatest place, that doesn't mean without its complexities.
Oh yeah, we know.
It's a complicated place. But when you get there, I found it incredible that you decide to take on the idea, or not even the idea, the identity of the Creole. This I found to be so fascinating because I, much like you, grew up in a way where it was like when people said they was Creole, it was like,
no, you black. You are light-skinned, uppity black person. This is too good to use black. And you know what? I'm gonna tell you something. This section of the book I was most afraid to write because again, I am on the internet. I have to get off to do my work, but I know how certain things you say can get taken out of context, can get mangled for someone because someone is uncomfortable, and you should be uncomfortable because what I talk about in the book is that one of my liaisons for this part was a woman named Tracy Colson Ante. Tracy Colson Ante is the 17th descendant of a woman, an enslaved black woman named Marie Quanquan, and a French merchant named Thomas Pierre Metoyer, and they had several children, and he manumitted her. She was a slave owner herself, and then her son they were responsible for this entire free people of color community in Cane River. In fact, I think they were the wealthiest free people of color in the nation at that time. When I went down there, and I said this in an interview with author Caitlin Greenidge for Zora magazine where I work, not once did they use the word rape. Not one time did they say he raped her, he took advantage of her, she had no choice. And it was hard for me to write that because my idea of enslaved black women's sexual lives is they didn't have a sexual life. It was all by force. It was all rape. Trigger warning for you all. I'm sorry if you any viewers of survivors. It was not pleasure. It was not a means of survival. It was not a means to get ahead within this oppressive economy. And I wanted to make sure that I wanted to show people, like, let these people speak for themselves. They've been hearing this oral history being told to them. And I've seen how it played out even with Beyonce. Beyonce in her September Vogue issue, she said a slave and a white man married, fell in love, and they had children. And people were upset about it. And they were like, no, that ain't true. And I'm like, but wait a minute though. It may not be true, but how do we constitute true? Because if we're just going by documentation, we can't do that as black people.
Right.
We just can't. Because a lot of times our oral histories, they ran opposite documented truth. Or they're just not held up as veritable. And I think it's anti-black. So it's like, how do we reconcile that? And even if we don't reconcile it, we can't erase it because we need to get to these hard, uncovered truths, but at the same time, understand that we may never know our ancestors fully. We may never know what they did that would be seen as terrible today, but they did as a means of survival. And so one of the things that I endeavored to do for the Louisiana section of my book is to not flatten the complexity of our ancestors. I wanted people to sit in the discomfort with me as someone who just thought she was a Black American New Jerseyan, and to understand that even I, as the researcher, was uncomfortable with the fact that there were Black people who were slave owners. There were thousands of them. And they participated in the plantation economy. I was never taught that. I was never taught that there were free people of color prior to Lincoln. I was never taught that Black people were free before, emancipation. I was never taught that they held slaves themselves. Now, granted, some of them held their family members as slaves to eventually manumit them, but still, they participated in that. So yeah, I didn't know any of that. It was shattering to me.
And so it was an amazing part to read that part and to read sort of even you sort of trying to work through your own. Like, Morgan, the dope shit about you is that a lot of this is really about you working through your own stuff, right? It's like, all right, this is what I thought. It turns out I was a little misguided.
I was wrong. You know
I was
what I mean?
wrong, right? And, you know, it's interesting, especially in the age of social media. Like, I mean, you sticking your neck in the guillotine a bit, but oh well. Like, it is what it is.
Right. And it's like, why does it make us uncomfortable? Let's unpack that. I hate that word, but it's like, why? And what good does it do us to erase it because we don't like to sit in it sometimes? What good does that do our people to not do that? And you know, and I wanted to show people like I'm new to all this. I just had a curiosity, but I had to get out of my own way and talk about it, because if I did it, if I try to omit it, then that's counterproductive to the reason why I took this journey in the first place.
Word up. So far, just so y'all know, just you can check in for a second. So far, we've covered some of the, for lack of a better word, some of the linchpins of what we know as the black culture, right? So we're talking about, we got food, we've got spiritual practices, and what have been written off as superstitions, right? Root work and these old school cultural spiritual practices. We've got water and the way, and our complex relationship with water, a really, really tricky relationship with water that so many of us have. And now, in thinking about the idea of the Creole community, and which is weird because I always assumed that they were part of the Black community. Maybe
and a lot of them would be too. No, let me just back up and say, there are some Creole people like, no, I'm Black. I'm just a particular.
Right, there are some Creole people. Yeah. And there are some Creole people don't even look.
No, I mean, I have a distant cousin, and I'm not gonna say his name, but I have a distant cousin who straight up said he don't identify as African American because Creole was an identity before Louisiana was even a part of the United States.
Exactly.
So he's like, no, I'm not African American. Whereas I spoke to other people, and they're like, no, Creole is an identity under African American. But that was because of when they became a part of America, they existed a part of the Black-white binary. And then Jim Crow just intensified that. So, yeah.
It's amazing. And so now we move on to another sort of, I don't want to say victim of the Black-white binary, but definitely another casualty of the Black-white binary, which is when you get to Oklahoma. Now this is interesting, right? Now I think this is fascinating because the other thing, I grew up in the neighborhood with a bunch of people who always said, I got Indian in my family. Now, if you were a kid who had reddish toned skin, if you had a nose that wasn't a quintessential sort of African nose, if you had hair that was a different texture, we could almost guess that you were going to say to us, I got Indian in my family. I got Indian in my family. And by the way, I'm not using Indian as a pejorative. This is literally this is like the term, right? I got Indian in my family. And it was used as a way to separate yourself. When I was a kid, it was used as a way to separate yourself from the rest of the regular Black people, right? It's like we were regular Black people, and you weren't regular. It sort of turned you into something exotic. It turned you into something other. In a way that gave you what you thought would be a bit of privilege. And I was fascinated with the idea when you get to Oklahoma, and because in your own family, and please touch on this, Morgan, in your own family, your mama, and by the way, your mama would say, we got Indian in our family. And then you say, which tribe? And her answer is the answer that all of my friends would say, which is Cherokee, right?
All right, so I'll blow y'all mind a little bit. All right, so just like Jason said, every Black person I knew said I got Indian in my family, just like you said, because of the phenotypic attributes. But we had no way of verifying that besides of what you may look like. Exactly. And so for me, I've been looking at conversations on the internet, and people would say when you claim that it's anti-Black, it's because you don't want to be seen as all Black, even though nobody in Black America is all Black. If you're descendant of enslaved Africans, you're not. But what was interesting to me was I didn't know for the Trail of Tears, for example, when the former President Andrew Jackson, I think it was in 1830, he forced the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and the Creek, to move western Mississippi into Indian Territory, which is known as Oklahoma. I didn't know that Black people accompanied them on that journey. I had no idea that the 5 civilized tribes, with the exception of the Seminoles, because they didn't participate in chattel slavery, it was more taxation for fugitives that came from the Low Country into Florida. I didn't know that they had slaves themselves and they brought them over to Indian Territory. And also, the Cherokee tribe was the largest slaveholding tribe out of all of them. So if their migratory patterns, because they came from Georgia and Tennessee now, if their migratory patterns mirrored that of African Americans, how could there not be connections there? And so that's what I wanted to explore. It's like, okay, maybe maybe all of us can, but I refuse to believe, and I spoke to scholars about this who specialize in Black and Indigenous studies. Not everybody's grandmother's lying. There's no way. We're not under collective delusion, especially when they also participated in the plantation economy themselves.
Yeah. I thought it was masterfully done. I've been talking to a lot of people over the course of the last 2 years about how not even every Black person is actually a descendant of Africa, right? Because of the creation of race and how we were forced into racial boxes. Either you had to check, you had to check color, or you had to check white.
Right. And I think a lot of people need to understand is like, I spoke to people who are called freedmen. So after emancipation, the people who held slaves, the 5 civilized tribes, what do we do with these Black people? Are they citizens of America or are they citizens of us? So they were given land allotments because of the US. They didn't believe in tribal land allotments. They started divided, but then they also started to divide people. So it was either you were a by-blood citizen or you were a freedman, which was someone of African descent who looked Black. So if you didn't look Black, you might be considered by blood. So you could be in the same family and someone could be on this role, you could be on that role, and your land allotments might be different. What's happening in the present day now is that you have these Black people who are freedmen who weren't given a blood degree, which prior to the separation was not a thing. They're not getting the benefits that by-blood citizens are getting. And it's by the virtue of their Blackness. And so we're seeing this distinction where at one point, I remember I spoke to a Seminole freedwoman. She told me we were one at one point, but it was because of these racial statutes, especially with Oklahoma, with the 1-drop rule and the Jim Crow, families just started splintering. And then because their land allotments were being encroached upon, what did? They started migrating again.
Of course. All right. And from there, and I'm sorry, I hate to rush through all this, but it's like, time is never a good thing for me because I just have so much I want to say to you, but I just, it is what it is. From there, Morgan sort of travels and journeys from Oklahoma to her last stop, which is California. Now, I want to make sure that we continue to couch this in the conversation that Morgan, this is a personal pilgrimage that she's finding out more and more about her own family. So we're talking about it from a macro level, but when you read the book, you realize these are micro moments where she's figuring out who she is, who her family is, and all the things that were never told to her, and all things that her family didn't know about themselves, and therefore that she didn't know about herself. And so it's a story about self-discovery, pilgrimage, about how home how home possesses multitudes and is a splintered word in and of itself, and it's a pluralized word, right? And so the last stop that Morgan makes before returning to New Jersey, or before finishing this book, is California. And this is interesting, right? Because this is where you say, I'm looking for this last bit, like, how can I get out west? There has to be a part of my story has to exist in.
Oh, broke up. Oh no. Oh no. Is Jason, did he break up?
Oh no, have we lost Jason?
I think so.
All right.
Let's see.
Well, until we can get him back, would you be okay if I started the question and answer period while we wait for him to get back?
Yeah, because I don't know what happened.
All right.
Broke up.
I'll message him right after this. Sorry, everybody. All right, so let's begin with a question from Sonia, who asks, are there other literary predecessors and books that have influenced the crafting of your book?
Oh, absolutely. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, Mules and Men and Go Tell It to My Horse by Zora Neale Hurston, Wayward Lies, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, the poetry of Kevin Young, and also the works of Jacqueline Woodson.
Amazing. All right, let's see. We have Kelsey saying, can't wait to get my copy, Morgan. How were you able to protect yourself through a project that seems like it would be emotionally difficult to carry through?
Prayer, also leaning on my friends and family, especially my friends, letting them know like I'm going through a lot right now. It's hard to read about these things and experience things when a lot of times by myself. So that's exactly how I did that, was just telling my friends what I was going through, making sure I checked in with them when I was in places where I was by myself. And that's what I did.
Amazing. It looks like Jason is back.
Yep. You're on mute, Jason. Oh, there you go. Is he?
All right, y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Our new reality, right? It's like what I was saying is that just to make sure the audience knows that this is a journey of personal discovery, right? That we're talking about it from an intellectual and sort of macro level, but when you read this book, this is all about Morgan really going out and discovering herself and her family and everything in between. The last stop is in California, and Morgan sort of poses the question, well, what exactly do I have to discover in California? What part of my story exists here in California? And then she says, well, it's the story that actually involves me, right? Specifically Morgan herself. And so just give us a bit of what you touch on in California, and then I want to jump into questions really quick. I'm so sorry that I...
No, okay. California.
She was a child actor, everybody. She was a child actor.
Oh my God. Okay. So California has always been a place of paradise for many people. Because of the palm trees, the sunny weather, the beaches. And I thought about it and I thought, geographically, that's the last place you can go till you end up in the Pacific. There's no place else you can go in America. That's the farthest you can travel. And so you see people who may have migrated to Texas go there, migrated to Oklahoma, they go there. And what I found was that even when we went there, we just found the same problems in a different area code. Police surveillance, police brutality, just the crowded housing, the lack of resources, the redlining, the segregation. But the difference is that Los Angeles, where I went, there was a powder keg moment that started with the 1965 Watts riots or uprising, depending on how you lean, you call it whatever one you want. The 92 Rodney King riots and uprising, and it's the cyclical nature. And so when I went there, I was unpacking just what California constituted for myself. When I went there as a child actor, and my uncles are in the record business, so what it meant for us, but just this idea of unlearning what I thought about gangs and territories, how a lot of that was precipitated by our movement being constricted because of these white institutions, because of these white people that wanted to curtail our movement since we were in the South. It was the same thing happening in a new area code. And so that's what I wanted to touch upon here. And I feel like that part was really prescient because towards the end of the book, I was with an underground rapper named No Can Do. And we were at the intersection of Florence and Normandy, which is where the 92 riots began. And I asked him, do you think this is going to happen again? And he said, yeah, like basically going to paraphrase, like if we don't reckon with how much white people would just not leave us alone, if we don't reckon with the devastation that they have done to our communities, it's going to happen again. And what happened? 2 years later from when he said that, the George Floyd protest happened. It was very prophetic and eerie.
What to close out this section before we get to Q&A. Serena, we're good on time, right?
Yeah, we're good.
All right. So to close out this section, I guess, Morgan, what I want to ask you is this journey, this pilgrimage from New York to New Jersey, which is home. Both of those places are home, to South Carolina and Georgia, Louisiana, Oklahoma, all the way to the West Coast of California, and then back again. What have you learned?
I learned that Black American experiences are a mosaic. Sometimes they push and collide against each other, but we have this unifying force of what it means to survive. I found that, it's one thing to talk about how Black people are resilient. It's another thing to see it. When you really document and talk to people who we should have been annihilated many times over. and we still here. I've also found that there may be things about my ancestors that I may never know, but I do know that they did what they had to do to get me here. And that's what's triumphant for me. I think another thing I realized is to pay attention to what elders say, even if they're rambling. Don't always just rely on documented proof, because a lot of times that documentation was not in our hands to begin with. So pay attention to the oral storytelling that's been circulating in your family for generations, because there's something there. And I think above all is to just realize that we are complicated people. We are a glorious people. And no matter where we are, coast to coast, region to region, across rivers and highways, we are still cosmically connected to each other in spite of time and distance. And so I think that that is something that I've learned throughout this journey. And it was a pilgrimage of sorts, and it was a full circle moment for me. And it was just so healing.
I have a buddy, my buddy Jeff, and I kept thinking of him when I was reading this book. He always used to say, he said, listen, if you want to know what culture is, he said, take a people and pull them away from where they're from and place them somewhere else. And whatever they do to survive, that is culture.
Wow, I love
that.
That
is culture. That is culture. Morgan, I appreciate you. This is the book. Now we're going to take some questions. By the way, the book is Wandering in Strange Lands. The link is in the chat. Please buy this book. Please buy it from Books Are Magic. Please buy it right now, actually. Make it happen. Let's do it. All right, so there's some questions we want to get to. Okay, this one is, are there other literary predecessors and books that have
influenced that one? So the one, so the open,
okay.
Yeah. So one on the open side, there's like, there's a couple there open. Do you see it?
Yeah, I see it. But that one's still over there. Okay. What about Morgan? How were you able to protect yourself?
I did that one. We only did two, so we did those two.
All right. With the knowledge you received about spirituality, how do you digest it in your everyday life? Is it connected to your religion and beliefs, or is it a separate entity?
That's my cousin. Hi, Leanna.
She's trying to go back and tell the family what you say.
I know. Right? No, so for me, like, I'm still a Christian. That is my faith. But I also realized that, like, I talk to other Black people who, for example, that say the book of Psalms is powerful. So for me, for example, today I lit a white candle. The white candle is used in churches all the time. And I just said a couple of prayers from the book of Psalms. I don't believe that it's connected from, religion is an institution. You know what I'm saying? And I know that my belief and what I believe in is separate from that, or it can be in harmony, but it's also, it could be, it could be a collision course. But I think for me, it's like, I digest it in my everyday life, knowing that there might be some practice that I pick up. There might be some practice that don't sit right with me, but what I'm not going to do is call what other Black people do demonic.
Here we go.
That's what I try to do.
What an amazing thing to be, is a little less judgmental, right? That's
pretty much it. It's like, I want to do what feels good to me, but I know where my faith lies, and any other practice that I incorporate, that's just for me to reorient and change at will.
Absolutely. I love this question. Morgan, the sheer amount of research and work that you did to write this book is so much. How did you stay organized? This is a problem I have with my own work. How did you stay organized?
Oh, but you're mad prolific though. So I mean, I'm just saying.
Listen, I'm inefficient, prolific, but inefficient.
Okay. But for me, oh man, I love to-do lists. Even to this day, I got sticky notes still on my office wall that I have not taken down, categorizing places where I went. Google Drive, different folders, color coding them. Looking at, I had a freelance transcriptionist help me. And I was able to afford one because of my book deal. So there's privilege in that. But I think it was a lot of different drafts. And honestly, and I hate to say it like this, but when I started looking at the transcriptions, I started seeing conversations form with people from different regions. So sometimes I didn't have to go too hard to figure out how would I want to organize it. The themes were starting to arise from the questions and the answers that I was getting. What did I decide to include and not include? I think what helped was using me as the focal point, as the anchor. When I talked to my family and used that as, okay, I'm gonna be the person, the vessel you hold on to throughout the pages, it was easy for me to start to filter out, okay, I don't need this from these other people. Let's make sure to keep this center and unified as much as possible as far as the narrative goes.
All right, I love this question. I know we're running out of time, but I want to take two more questions. I love this question. Brother Antoine says, waiting on my copy of Wandering in Strange Lands to arrive, but thank you for this convo and book. Many of us from the Low Country left home and entered the world feeling ashamed because of how we spoke and lived. So this is special to me. Morgan, what's something that you didn't get a chance to do during your visit to the Low Country, like crabbing, shrimping, cooking red rice and sausage, that you'd like to do on your next visit? Antoine, first of all, shout out to you, shout out to the Low Country, and shout out to you being like, Morgan, I know you're going back down there. So,
oh, I am. I tell people all the time, the Low Country is one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. And Antoine, all of it, food, all of it. I want to do I didn't get to do any of that because I was so hyper focused on my book deadline and getting these interviews done that I really didn't get time to have fun, so to speak. I mean, I did a little bit. I put my feet in the Sapelo Island, the Atlantic Ocean, but that's about it. So anything that's to do with the cuisine, I am all in there.
Word. And then let's do, there's some good questions. Sorry, everybody, I won't be able to get to all of them. But basically, do you feel like you have a stronger sense of your identity, and are there more travels? Is there anything left that you need to explore in terms of understanding Morgan Jerkins, like the Jerkins story?
Yeah, because I'm still finding cousins that are like, oh, I'm in Mobile, Alabama, for example. I'm like, oh, I didn't know anything about that. And also I think about my maternal grandmother. She's from Maryland. So I'm just like, all right, well, I don't know many things about them either. Like, there's all of these different threads. Now, when you say, do I have a stronger sense of my identity? Yeah, it's multitudes. It's multitudes, and the fact that it's okay to be inconclusive. And there's no reason to be ashamed of that. It may be because of white supremacy. It also could be because my ancestors were human beings and I don't need to know the fullness of their interiorities. And that's okay.
And that's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am beside myself to have had the opportunity. You know, Morgan, we are, one day we're going to be old, God willing. And, you know, we have our own heroes in this literary thing, the world of letters. And I always think about these moments and think how one day we can be able to say that we had this moment, that there was this conversation. And I appreciate the work you've done here. I think this is an important document, an important brick in the wall of you understanding you, but also me understanding me and my family. And a lot of us are going to feel closer and more curious about all of the intricacies and the nooks and crannies of our personal identities and how broad and vast those are in scope. And so thank you for your work. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for your candor. And thank you for inviting me to do this with you. I appreciate it.